Hello guys, so this week I'm going to talk about caching in Next.js and how it works in conjunction with the fetch API. So these two have tripped me a lot, and I'm sure you have experienced some of the problems that I'm going to highlight here. So for example, let's say we want to display data from fetch API call here. So let's say we want to add an endpoint that returns the current time. So we can add a root handler here called in the API folder called local time, for example. So root.ts. So this root handler is a get function that just returns a JSON object with the time value here. So this is just the local time. So let's call that API here. So in X13, that is simple. So we just need to await a fetch call here and display it. So for example, it will just be equals to response is equals to fetching our endpoint here. So let's just make this a full URL. So we call our endpoint, we get the value from JSON, and then we display here. So let's just display the time value here. So if we look at the browser, you can see the full time here is 8:49 p.m. So if we refresh the page, notice that the time doesn't change. It's a static value. So that is because by default, all pages in Next.js are static pages. So these are generated only once and not every time the page is refreshed. So how do I make it so that we get the real time value of the current time here so that it changes every time you refresh, you get the correct time? So there's two ways to do it. So one way is to turn the whole page into a dynamic component. So one way is to export a variable here called dynamic. So export const dynamic is equals to pos dynamic. So this forces the page to be a dynamic page. So if we go to the page and then refresh it, you can see now the time value changes every time we refresh. So that is one way. So another way to make this page dynamic is to add a cache option to the fetch API and set its value to no store. So this can either be no store or no cache. They do the same thing. So if we set it to that, the page is automatically turned into a dynamic page. So the first time I tried this, it looked like magic because fetch API is a standard API and is not dependent on whether you're using it inside Node.js or Next.js, for example, or the browser. But what I came to realize is that this fetch API here is not the real fetch API. Next.js patches this in the background and adds options like this. So because this is their own fetch implementation, that's why they're able to automatically get if we have added the cache option to the fetch API, and then they automatically turn the whole page into a dynamic page. Now this opens up another whole set of ways that you can trip yourself. But what if I don't want to turn the whole page into a dynamic page just because I want to make this one fetch call? Well, there's still a third way to do this. So we can remove the no cache option here and the dynamic option here and leave the page dynamic. But what we can do is we can create a separate component that is a child of this page that will fetch the dynamic data. So for example, if we say add a new component, so let's say components time.tsx. So export default function time, and then we want to do the same thing we did here in that component. So we want to do the fetch and display the data here. So same thing, let's make this an async component, but make this avoid the cache, set this to no store. So this will fetch the real time value of time, while here we are fetching the cached value of time. So let's display both values inside this page component, and you can see the difference in the display. So our first value here is the static value. So that's the static value, and our other one is a dynamic value. So that is the time component. So let's see how this behaves. So if you go to our browser, you can see the static value is 8:49. This one says 8:59. So let's refresh the page. So you can see that the static value remains static and the dynamic value is changing dynamically. So our solution was simply to move the data that you want to be dynamic into its own component. Then we can disable cache in that component instead of disabling it on the parent component, because if we disable it here, all the page becomes dynamic instead of statically generated. So that is one issue. So what if our API endpoint here makes another fetch call to a remote service to get the time from there? So for example, let's add another root handler here called, say, remote time root.ts. So also this returns a get function that returns the time, but this time we want to call a remote API. So let's make this function async. So the response will be a fetch call to say the world time API. So this returns the current time of New York. So we can get the date time value from the response and then pass it into our date time function here, and then make sure that the time zone is set to the correct time zone. So this returns the current local New York time. So in our page, so let's change this to call the remote time API, and we can get rid of the static and dynamic stuff. So let's just display the time. Let's start with the static time first. So the local time there is 1:05 p.m. So again, we can turn it dynamic by adding an export const dynamic is equals to, we can force it to be dynamic. So let's refresh. So why is it not returning the dynamic value? That should have fixed it, right? So it looks like our remote API here is now caching itself. So we have again called the extended fetch function, and Next.js is doing its background magic there. So let's actually open that API URL here and see what's really happening. So you can see the API endpoint. No matter how many times you refresh it, it always returns the same value. So the API endpoint is caching itself, even if you call it from outside our Next.js application. So how do we make this dynamic? Well, the same thing that we did for the page component. So we can export the dynamic const here, and automatically the page will become dynamic. So if we refresh the page, we will now be getting dynamic values. So you can see the time is now changing. Does that happen for the main page here again? So if we refresh the main page, you can see that the values are also changing dynamically here. So to get this to work, we had to add the force dynamic on both the page and the root handler. So if we remove the dynamic value here and add it to the root handler, the page will still be static. You can see that it doesn't change. So again, instead of exporting the dynamic property here, we could add the cache property here to the fetch function. So with that option, the value will still be dynamic and will still behave the same way for the page component. So what's confusing here is that when you're adding the dynamic prop to the fetch function, initially the page automatically became dynamic. But if that fetch is nested within another fetch request, then adding it to that nested fetch request does not automatically turn the parent page where the fetch API was called dynamic. So you also have to add the dynamic prop manually. So if this call was nested in a child component, there will be no way for you to rely on this being added on the parent component. So for example, if we just use our time component here and remove the fetch stuff here, and then inside our time component, we use the remote time endpoint, we have to make sure that the no-stop property is set on both fetch requests. So for the original one and also for the child fetch request, you also have to add the no-stop property. Otherwise, one of them will be cached and another will not. So if you remove the cache from the parent one, then the data won't be cached, even if the child one is cached. So this will remain static. So same thing, if we add it here and then in the child fetch call we remove it, then this one will be cached, and then this one won't be cached. So again, the date won't update. Wait a minute, it's updating. So caching is enabled by default on the remote time handler here, but disabled on the parent fetch call. So if we look at our API, so if we refresh this, the value does not change. It's always the same one value. And if you go to the app and refresh the page, notice that the time has changed, and this is calling our cached endpoint here. You can see the value has changed again, but if we refresh it multiple times, it doesn't change it. So if we call the endpoint manually, the time is fixed, but if we call it in the context of our time component here, it actually calls the original endpoint with caching disabled. So you can see the time has updated here, which means here if we refresh it, the time will now be updated to 1:27:12. So this is frying my brain right now. So if we disable caching here, so we have disabled caching here and on the root handler, so we are getting it's 1:30 there. So this also should return us somewhere around there, 1:30, and here should give us around the same. So you lose your brain cells even more if you set different values on both of these fetch requests. So I think the correct solution is to make sure that both of the fetch requests have the value set to no store. If you remove it on one and add it on the other, you'll get weird results. So apart from that madness, in a root handler, you can force the root handler to be dynamic in another way that doesn't have to involve the dynamic or the cache properties. So all you have to do is use the request object. So if you have the request object like that and try to access it like that, this page automatically becomes dynamic as long as you use a property of the request object. So with that, if we refresh our root handler here, we'll be getting dynamic values, which means for the app too, if we refresh it, you'll also get the updated values. So that was weird. I don't know what logic went into like overriding standard APIs like the fetch API. This looks like a terrible idea, and you can see how it can really trip you up trying to figure out why things are happening the way they're happening. So I hope that little demonstration was helpful, and I hope you understand the fetch API a little better. So thank you so much for watching, and see you next week.